Hey everybody, and welcome back to Submarine History. Today, we're going to have a briefing on the role of U.S. Army artillery forward observers in the Pacific during World War II. This is a companion piece to briefing number 44, Radio Disaster at Tarawa, where I discuss the problems Marines encountered with their radios during that invasion. We'll talk about how the role of the forward observer came about, how they were organized and operated, and then we'll talk a little bit about the technology they used and the experiences of forward observers in the 37th Infantry Division during the New Georgia campaign. Go Buckeyes! Read the description to this briefing. It has related references and links. I have a Discord as well, and there's an invitation link on the channel banner. If you like the briefing, you can leave a super thanks or consider a channel membership. Your donation helps offset the cost of purchasing books, professional memberships, and software needed to write and record the briefings you've come to enjoy and appreciate. Finally, thank you to the United States Naval Institute for all they do preserving and promoting world naval history. If you have any questions about the briefing, leave them in the comment section below, and I'll do my best to answer them. Let's briefly talk about the historical role of artillery on the battlefield. For the first 900 years, artillery was used in a direct fire support role on the battlefield. That meant artillery would be placed such that, from the artillery position itself, we'd have an unobstructed view of the battlefield. Preferably, we're on high ground and just a few hundred yards behind our own infantry, at least in Napoleonic times. We can do this because the range and accuracy of infantry weapons is short, about 100 yards for smoothbore musket loaders. We can be safe behind our lines, but still close enough that we can easily observe and adjust our artillery fire. Notice in the picture the officer with a monocular in his hand directing the cannon fire. By the time we get to the U.S. Civil War, the range of infantry weapons is increasing as rifles start to replace smoothbore muskets. Artillery is also increasing its range out to several miles. These developments push artillery further back from the front lines, but we're still using it in the direct fire role, as depicted in this painting. And again, we can see an officer observing and directing the cannon fire. At this point in history, the idea of using artillery in the indirect fire role, meaning our artillery doesn't have a line of sight to the target, it's understood that you can do this, but the problem is that there's no practical way for an observer to communicate adjustments to an artillery battery, say behind a hill a mile away. You could fire blindly, but accuracy was an issue, and there was a lot of fear of hitting your own troops. So even though it's possible to use artillery in the indirect fire role, we're still doing direct fire as late as the Spanish-American War in 1898. And again, in the picture, we see an officer observing and adjusting the direct fire. What changes occur on the battlefield that finally moves artillery to the indirect fire support role? The change on the battlefield is that, beginning with World War I, the effective range of infantry and artillery weapons is long enough to put anything out in the open and observable at risk of being taken under fire. As often is the case, there are two sides to a story, and that holds true with artillery in World War I. By World War I, we have enough technologies to start making indirect artillery practical and sort of safe. Telephones are used on the battlefield now, so we can do things like use balloons to observe rounds impacting and instantly communicate adjustments back to artillery batteries, concealed miles behind our front lines. We also have precision optical instruments that make it possible to have fixed observation posts far enough back to be safe, yet still be able to observe rounds and communicate accurate adjustment instantly. This gets indirect fire to the point where it can be used against large static targets. If the battlefield is well defined and our troops are moving in a predictable way, we can even do things like rolling or creeping artillery barrages to protect our troops as they advance. Likewise, we can draw the enemy into pre-planned firing zones and saturate them with concentrated artillery barrages. However, something remains elusive, and that's using artillery on a rapidly changing battlefield to support infantry as it uses fire and maneuver tactics. At Fort Sill, home of U.S. Army artillery, the Army would spend the 1920s and 30s trying to solve this problem of safe, accurate artillery fire delivered quickly in a maneuver warfare environment. By the mid-1930s, the Army had developed a solution to this problem: the Fire Direction Center, or FDC, and the Forward Observer Team, the FO Team. Let's take a look at the structure of a typical artillery battalion during World War II. During World War II, in general, one artillery battalion would support an infantry regiment. Within the artillery battalion, we have 3 firing artillery batteries. Each one of those batteries would be assigned to support one infantry battalion from that regiment. Let's take a closer look at the artillery battalion. In this case, we're looking at the structure of a light artillery battalion. Light because the battalion consists of 105mm howitzers, which were the workhorse artillery pieces for infantry support at the time. The basic light artillery battalion consisted of a headquarter battery, a service battery, and 3 firing batteries. And each of the firing batteries would have 4 howitzers, in this case here, 105mm. There is 1 fire direction center for the artillery battalion and 1 forward observer team attached to each firing battery. The FDC is in the rear with the headquarter battery and the battery guns, while the forward observer teams operate with their assigned infantry battalion at the front. All right, learning is always better with pictures, right? Here is a typical 105mm howitzer in action. The gunner on the right, if you look closely, you can see he's holding a phone to his ear, and you can see the telephone bag down by his left foot. He's communicating with the FDC. In addition to 105mm howitzers, each artillery division would have a battalion of 155mm howitzers. As a forward observer, even though you're primarily calling in fire from your 105 battery, you could make a call and tap the 155s for counter battery fire. These 155s here in the picture are on Okinawa. Mortars. We have them on the battlefield, but they are organic to the infantry, and an artillery FO has no control over them. They had their own FDC and their own observers in the field. As an artillery FO, you might run into them, and there were opportunities to coordinate fires with them. This is a typical FDC. It's the nerve center of the artillery battalion. It's taking fire support requests from as many as 3 forward observer teams, calculating the firing solutions, then sending that info to any of its 3 firing batteries so they can complete the fire support request. The FDC can also coordinate fire from multiple batteries and even other artillery units if needed. Now note the plotting tables. They used battlefield maps marked up with information the FDC needed to complete the fire support missions. As an example, the FDC needed to know where the FO teams were, as well as landmarks or other known locations that the FO team would use to adjust from. A forward observer on the battlefield would call for fire support, indicating the location of the target relative to a known point on the battlefield that the FO and the FDC both know about. This is called shift from a known point, and this is an initial single round for spotting purposes. The forward observer sees where the round hits and communicates back to the FDC an adjustment. If the round is long, meaning it went past where the target is, the FO tells the FDC to drop enough distance so that the next round falls short of the target. Then the FO splits that difference to add, hoping that the third round is on the mark. Okay, and then we just rinse and repeat. This is called bracketing, and you do it for long, short, and left-right shots. During peacetime in the early 1930s, a bombardment could reach a target within 8 minutes after the initial support call. But by 1942, the time to complete a fire support request was down to 4 minutes. Now, I'm going to leave that at that for now. We could talk for an hour about how to call fire missions, and if there's interest, I can do a separate briefing on the exact procedures to call for fire, adjust, and then fire for effect. And I could even do that with ARMA. So let me know in the comments if you'd like to see that. The FO is not usually on the target line between the battery and the target, so the FDC has to know where the FO team is because the adjustments are from the perspective of the FO himself. Now you can see in the upper left-hand corner the telephone switchboards and the bank of phones connecting the FOs to the FDC and all the firing batteries. We're going to talk more about communications in a moment. Okay, the forward observer team. The forward observer team has at least 3 or 4 members. And the FO team consists of the forward observer himself, or FO, and that was a second or first lieutenant. There was an assistant FO who would have been a non-commissioned officer. You had a telephone operator, wire lineman, who was enlisted, and then you had a radio operator who was also enlisted. The FO team would work alongside an infantry company commander. There is one artillery FO for 3 infantry companies, so the FO may be moving around a lot depending on what's going on. And it was not uncommon for the FO team to actually be out in front of the infantry company some distance if it meant they could set up in a prime observation position. So this was incredibly dangerous work to be an FO. The FO himself could be very conspicuous with binoculars, and the radios they used had really long antennas which would draw a lot of attention. On the battlefield, the FO team would be a high priority target of the enemy, and it was paramount that the team use cover and concealment to the maximum extent possible. They carried maps with a lot of sensitive information on them, and if the FO team got captured, and that did happen, it was a real problem. The FO team, they would have a Jeep and a trailer, as the radios they used were still pretty heavy, and they had to carry like miles of telephone wire. So they would drive as far forward as possible, try to leave the Jeep someplace safe, and then proceed on foot with the infantry. That relationship between the FO and the company commander was very important. That company commander had to have a lot of trust in that FO that he wouldn't bring down a barrage on top of himself and his company. Once an FO showed that he knew what he was doing, a bond of trust and respect could be developed to maximize results on the battlefield. Okay, let's talk about the equipment that the FO team used. There were a lot of different radios used by the U.S. military during World War II, like hundreds of radios for all kinds of purposes, and we could talk about them for days. We're only going to look at 2 right now, which were used by Army artillery, and those are the green rows on the table. And we're going to compare them to a couple of radios used by Army infantry. Those are the yellow lines on the table. Okay, let's go over this table real quick, and then we'll look at some pictures. All the radios on this table were available at the time of Operation Torch in North Africa, starting in November of 1942. There was the SCR 284, which was a high-frequency radio using AM modulation. It was portable, and it could be used by the forward observer team, but it was bulky and heavy, so it tended to be used at the artillery battalion headquarters for communications with higher headquarters. The SCR 608, 609, 610 family of radios, those were VHF radios using FM modulation. They were used in tanks, observation aircraft, and by the forward observer teams. 3 versions of the same radio, the only difference being if it was carried in the field or installed in an aircraft, tanks, or soft vehicles. These 2 radio systems couldn't communicate with each other because they operated in different ranges of the radio spectrum and they used different radio wave modulation methods. The SCR 536 and 300 radios, they were used by the infantry for their own internal comms at the company battalion level. And I have them here just because these are the radios you tend to see in war movies, so you're going to recognize them. This is the SCR 284 radio. It breaks down into 3 loads for carrying in the field. There was the radio, which was 45 pounds, a radio accessories bag, which was 40 pounds, and then an antenna bag, which was 25 pounds. So the whole kit weighed around 110 pounds. Portable, but not really portable. There were 2 antennas for the radio, a 25-foot rod antenna used in the field and a 15-foot antenna used on vehicles. And that's what I mean about these radios being conspicuous on the battlefield. There was a small battery inside of the radio compartment. However, in this picture, if you look closer, you'll see a soldier operating a hand-powered generator that could be used to power the radio. And that hand generator was part of the radio accessory bag. These radios were also used by naval gunfire liaison teams. And in briefing number 44, I included discussion about those SCR 284s used by those teams. This is the SCR 609 radio on the left and the SCR 610 radio on the right. Like I said, same radio, but the 610 fits into a mounting bracket in a vehicle and it uses a vehicle-mounted antenna. It breaks down into 2 loads for carrying in the field. The radio, 35 pounds, and then the radio accessory bag, 38 pounds. And that includes the radio batteries and the antenna. So this kit weighs around 73 pounds, and it was used with a single 12-foot rod antenna. Now you might be asking yourself, how did they use these radios in the field being so bulky to move around and with those tall antennas? There was an accessory the FO team carried called the Remote Control Unit RM29. This unit could be plugged into either the SCR 284 or the SCR 609 radio, and it could be used to control the radio remotely. This would allow you to set the radio, say on the reverse side of a hill, out of enemy sight, even with the antenna extended. The radio operator stayed with the radio. The rest of the team, and that was the FO, the assistant FO, and their phone wire bubba, they would be on the forward side of the hill, moving around out in front as needed, even hundreds of yards away from the radio, to get the field of view they needed to support the infantry company they were attached to. I didn't mention this before, but those radios, the SCR 284 and 609, they were also connected to the FDC by wire when possible. That allowed the FO to use the system as a radio or as a phone. And the FO did this through a switch on the remote control unit. Here we have an FO using the remote control unit. Now in this picture, he happens to be next to his SCR 609 radio. But like I said, he would usually be way out in front with the remote control unit that was tethered to the radio. And the radio itself would be some distance back, safely tucked away and out of sight. In radio mode, the FO's voice would pass from the remote control unit to the radio, and then the radio would transmit the voice to the FDC. In phone mode, the FO's voice would pass from the remote control unit through the radio and back to the FDC on the wire connecting the radio to the FDC. If you're an FO team on the beach during an invasion, not practical to run wire back to the ship, so you're using that system as a radio. If you're on the ground in New Georgia or Guadalcanal, you're likely using the system as a phone. Whenever possible, you want it to use the system as a phone. If for no other reason the enemy can't eavesdrop on your comms and you can speak in plain language, and that's a big deal. Your position also can't be DF'd, or direction finding, which is even a bigger deal. And your voice quality is also higher. If you had to use the system as a radio, in that case, you had to follow some kind of clear coding process. Transmitting in the clear means that we're talking in plain language without any encryption or coding, which was unwise to say the least. Encrypting radio messages during a battle, when you had to be able to bring down Artie in a moment's notice, it wasn't really practical, and you wouldn't want to be using encrypted machines near the front and risk them getting captured anyways. So instead, the FO would have a code book, and that would allow him to do some simple word substitutions to obscure messages quickly. This code example is taken from briefing number 4, and this was called the shackle code, and it described a system where parts of a radio message could be quickly encoded using a simple code that changed on a daily basis. Now, the Marines chose to address this issue by using the Navajo code talkers. There were some optical instruments available to the FO team. The M1916 Battery Commander's Telescope could accurately measure horizontal angles. The M16 rangefinder did just that, find the distance to a target. And then the M1918 aiming circle could measure horizontal and vertical angles. These instruments were more precise to use than simple binoculars, but not really practical for the FO team to carry around on the battlefield, so they tended to be used from fixed observation posts in the rear. And here are some examples. The picture on the left looks like a fixed observation point during World War II. Lots of equipment laying around a prepared position. You can see on the left above the radio operator a soldier using a rangefinder. We also have a chap maybe updating a range card or a map, and then there's a spotting scope as well. The picture on the right is from World War I, but the same deal. We're using the Battery Commander Telescope from some kind of fixed position. Like the photo on the left, we have a soldier with binoculars and another one using a spotting scope. FO teams themselves didn't often work from fixed, prepared observation positions. You're on the move a lot, and you're temporarily setting up behind things like rocks, trees, small hills, or in shell craters. And then finally, just for historical reference, that's the SCR 536 radio on the left and the SCR 300 radio on the right. These are the radios you usually see in World War II movies, and they would be used by the infantry for their own internal comms. And they were not compatible with the radios that the forward observer teams were using. All right, let's wrap this all up with a brief discussion on the experiences of forward observer teams from the 37th Infantry Division in the Pacific. For this briefing, I was able to find 2 books about forward observers in World War II. One book is Forward Observer by Edwin Westrate. It was written in 1944 and based on a series of interviews with surviving members of a forward observer team in North Africa while they were recovering in a field hospital. The book does an excellent job discussing how the FO team operated and what they experienced in North Africa, while not giving away too much detailed information about equipment and the combat units involved in the campaign. You know, because it was written during wartime. But from the description of the action in the book, I'm pretty sure the book's characters were part of the 9th Infantry Division. But this book has got everything. It's got action, it's got suspense, a love interest, and an incredible surprise ending. I mean, seriously, this book could be a movie, and it's a quick read too, so I highly recommend it. Bracketing the Enemy by John R. Walker. This was the other book I was able to find about forward observers, and the book is in 2 parts. The first part follows the 37th Infantry Division, or the Buckeye Division, which was a National Guard unit from Ohio that fought in the Pacific. And then the second half of the book follows the 87th Infantry Division, or the Golden Acorn, and that was an Army Reserve division comprised of troops from the Gulf Coast states, and that fought in Europe. And this is a really well-researched book, and I think it's a great read. And I can't emphasize that enough. I mean, I've been doing this for like about 4 years, and one thing I've learned is that it's really uncommon to find a military history book that's informative and enjoyable to read. And both these books check that box. And they're both available through Amazon Kindle. The 37th Infantry Division was mobilized in October 1940. It shipped out to the Pacific in May of 1942, and it landed in Fiji that June. The division spent 9 months there doing advanced training, then moved on to Guadalcanal in April of 1943. From there, the division participated in the New Georgia Campaign in July of 1943, followed by a return to Guadalcanal in September, and then back out to participate in the Bougainville Campaign in November of 1943. The last campaign for the division was the invasion of the Philippines. The 37th hit the beach at Lingayen Gulf in January 45, and it spearheaded the liberation of Manila in March. This was a well-decorated unit. 9 distinguished unit citations, and I'm going to read through these citations just really quickly, just bear with me here. 7 Medals of Honor, 116 Distinguished Service Crosses, 4 Distinguished Service Medals, 1,008 Silver Stars, 71 Legions of Merit, 101 Soldiers' Medals, and 6,807 Bronze Stars. Casualties, 5,960 total casualties. Of that, 1,094 killed in combat, 4,861 wounded, 4 missing in action, 1 prisoner of war, 592 days of combat. Today, this unit exists as the 37th Brigade Combat Team, still mostly an Ohio unit, and which made deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, I'm mentioning all this stuff because my one peeve about the unauthorized history of the Pacific War podcast is that, in my opinion, they talk some trash about the National Guard during the various campaigns in the Pacific, especially Episode 209, Operation Toenails, which covers the New Georgia campaign. The fact is, by the time the 37th landed in New Georgia, they had been on active duty since October 1940 and training for 33 months, with about 12 months in Fiji and Guadalcanal. So they were as well trained as any active duty unit. They went through the same learning curve any Army division would experience the first time they entered combat. And don't get me wrong, I think they have a great channel podcast. It's just a disappointment how they address this particular aspect of the Pacific War. Okay, enough about that. The last thing I'll cover is the experience of forward observers during the New Georgia campaign. And before we get into that discussion, understand that the 37th, their forward observers, they had trained at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, which is a long way from New Georgia and the Solomon Islands. Stateside, they trained in a part of the country with vast plains that provided excellent fields of view. And initially, they also trained to set up forward, but well behind the troops they were supporting. One lesson learned by the Operation Torch forward observer teams was that you couldn't sit back. You had to be up front and alongside the infantry. So by the time of the New Georgia campaign, the 37th forward observer teams, they would have known this. And as they spent time in Fiji and Guadalcanal, they probably developed an inkling that observation was going to be challenging in the jungle. But until you were in combat doing the job, you just didn't know how challenging it actually was going to be. So the 37th Infantry, they participated in the New Georgia campaign, which began at the end of June 1943. And this is about 4 months before the radio disaster the Marines experienced at Tarawa in November. And these are some of the lessons learned by the forward observer teams from action in New Georgia. First lesson, the radios performed poorly in a humid tropical environment because of moisture wreaking havoc on the radio components. And this is different from what would happen at Tarawa when the Marine TBY and TBX radios were physically submerged in water while they're trying to get to the beach. We're talking here just about daily exposure to moisture from the humid air. Two other problems were topography and the jungle density. New Georgia is a rugged and mountainous. The teams were quickly exhausted carrying the radio components, and the VHF radio waves were blocked by the mountains and absorbed by the dense jungle vegetation. This leads us to the second lesson, which is use telephones to the maximum extent possible. That doesn't mean that there weren't any problems with telephones. You had to periodically sweep your wire to make sure infiltrators didn't hook in and eavesdrop. You'd also be laying wire down along trails that vehicle used, and wire could get chewed up by tracks and tires, and that could become personnel intensive just maintaining that wire. The third lesson, since the jungle was so dense, as a FO, you really couldn't see very far. That meant often you couldn't visually spot rounds. So to overcome this problem, you had to learn to adjust rounds by sound. Now, I know that sounds crazy, but they were actually able to do it fairly effectively. To be safe, you had to make sure your first rounds went well past the target. Then you'd cut down the range gradually and walk the rounds into the target. You might have another FO nearby, and if you did, you both could take a bearing by ear and try to do a triangulation off of that. The fourth lesson. It was common to fire the howitzers at close to maximum elevation to hit enemy positions on reverse slopes or to bring your rounds right down in front of your own troops. Some unit commanders wanted rounds dropped as close as 50 yards to their own line when the textbook safe distance was more like 400 to 500 yards. High-angle rounds were subject to wind drift. There were also variations in the amount of gunpowder in rounds from different production lots, which could cause some additional error. So as the FO, you risk hitting friendly troops. The Japanese would try to capitalize on this fear by occasionally tossing artillery or mortar rounds into U.S. lines during a U.S. artillery barrage. And this would give U.S. troops the impression that their own arty was firing short, causing fear and confusion, and maybe causing a pause or stop to the barrage itself. Now, this tactic did actually work. And the lesson learned was that the FO and the company commander, they just had to have a really good understanding of each other's abilities, judgment, and tactical knowledge, coupled with an understanding of what the FO can safely do. When FO teams carried radios into the field, they left their heavy SCR 609 radio sets behind, and they used this little SCR 511 radio, which was used with the SCR 284 acting as a base station. Originally, this SCR 511, this was developed to be used by horse-mounted artillery. You'd be in the saddle and just set the staff, or what we call a guide on. We just set it in a little holder, and you just operate it like that. And this was a low-power radio, only like 1 watt with a range of 1 to 2 miles. But it was light enough, and you could carry it into the jungle, and it got the job done. Wow, that's it. We're at the end of the briefing. I really enjoyed researching this topic, and I hope you got something useful out of it. It's definitely a topic you could talk about for days, and I'm sure down the road we'll come back and revisit it. So leave your questions and comments below. Stop by the Submarine History Discord and say hi. Till next time. Peace out.